life, and it is these that God works for good. But perhaps most of all, I want us to learn from Hannah what it means to live a life of loving faithfulness to God in the face of much personal trial and cost. We'll see that from Hannah. So this is what we should think. I know someone a little he's written a book called The Faith-Shaped Life. Well, that is what God asks. If you're a Christian, if you're truly a Christian this morning, that's what God asks of you and me, that your life should be faith-shaped. Hannah's life was, you'll see, in large part faith-shaped. Well, what will we see from this then? Well, let's introduce ourselves to the family. They were a fairly ordinary family in some ways. In that opening verse with those various strange place names and so on, we're told that Elkanah, who was Hannah's husband, belonged to the tribe of Ephraim. Remember the 12 tribes. And if you remember Josh's tribe, Joshua had been buried in that area, and so had the son of Aaron, Moses' brother. They were a prosperous family, various signs of that, fairly well-to-do. Elkanah, I think, was a good man. Perhaps he was gentle in his ways. And we see, verse 3, year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty in a town called Shiloh. That was also in the territory of Ephraim. He did it to make free will offerings. Perhaps it might have been at harvest time, or it might have been a time of thanksgiving, or perhaps a peace offering. We're not told. But he had 2 wives. We're told. He had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. You remember what was true of these people, of these 2 wives. Peninnah had children. Hannah didn't. What else are we told? In verse 5, it said that when they went up each year, Elkanah gave portions of meat to his wife Peninnah and all her sons and daughters. We don't know how many they were. He was a generous man. He gave that to those children as well. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion. Hannah had twice as much as Peninnah had. Peninnah's family had more, of course, all those kids. But Hannah had twice as much as Peninnah. Why? Because Elkanah loved her. He longed that she should have a child and she didn't. And he wanted to show his love. Possibly he had taken a second wife, Peninnah, in response to Hannah being childless. We don't know. But what we do know is that as a result of this, it led to bitter jealousy. It became a running sore in the family. We're told twice the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. It says in verse 5, says again in verse 6. But because of that, her rival, what a name to give to Peninnah's relationship to Hannah, her rival kept provoking her. She didn't do it once. Every opportunity she would do that. Probably because of the different way in which she knew her husband treated her. And so there we are. There's a whole number of misunderstandings. Well, I think there were 3 particular ones. This is the first one, that Hannah is misunderstood and provoked, and irritated in a deliberate way by Peninnah. It hurt her. Perhaps not as much as her childlessness, but it hurt her. Childlessness and other profound disappointments in family life are some of the most hurtful things that we can encounter. I don't know, perhaps some of you can point to that kind of disappointment yourself. This disappointment of childlessness. Childlessness is a bit like bereavement, I think. The utter sadness of longing for a child of your own, particularly true for women, isn't it? My aunt, the closest aunt to me, Winifred, her name was. She was childless. Childless. Would have longed for a child. That's the family. Well, what do we see of Hannah in this family? First, that Hannah was challenged to learn what it meant to live faithfully while being misunderstood. Let's have a look at that. That's perhaps the point I want to say most about. We don't know how many years this annual low point of sorrow went on, but we know that her sadness was clear to Elkanah. She was grievously irritated. And at one particular visit, we're told, there was one occasion that you will read about it in verse 9. Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, there was this one occasion when this story revolves around it. And we're told on each year, whenever she went, she wept, she wouldn't eat. Eating was a central part of what was going on. She just refused the food. And so on. And Elkanah, we're told, he says to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downcast? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? That's the second misunderstanding. Peninnah, Elkanah misunderstands. He doesn't understand. In the little book of Ruth, which, if you've got your Bible open, you might even be able to see the book of Ruth on the left-hand side of your page. It is in mine. Well, in the story of Ruth, we're told that in Ruth's relationship to Naomi, her mother-in-law, that she was better to Naomi than 10 sons. But this is not how they felt here. Elkanah's 3 times, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Sounds a rebuke, doesn't it? You shouldn't be. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? It could only have hurt Hannah even further. And there was this year, as we see, when her sadness overflowed. No doubt she'd lived through several new births to Peninnah. There's no birth control, so Peninnah might have had a child almost every year. I don't know how many there'd have been. That's why he gave gifts to Peninnah and all her sons and daughters. It was like a tribe. But after they'd completed the service, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, when perhaps they were almost on their way to go home, they're somewhere near the entrance, we're told. Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple, probably the entrance. And we're told that Hannah, somewhere near the entrance, prayed to the Lord in bitterness of soul. Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. Peninnah, if she had noticed, was not to be seen, nor was Elkanah. And she makes this vow to God, Lord Almighty, if you'll only look on your servant's ministry and remember me, not forget, but give me a son, I'll give him back to you all his life. And you remember how it's told very graphically that Eli can see her mouth moving. See? Hannah was praying in her heart. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thinks she's drunk. Tells her to give up on the wine. Says something about Eli, doesn't it? And she makes this vow. Had Eli never noticed the difference between the two wives each year? There's a dreadful spiritual culture in Shiloh, as we would see if we'd read any further. We're told that Eli is an old man. His two sons are the priests there, Hophni and Phinehas. Do you know what they did? When people brought an offering, they insisted that when they were boiling the meat, that the priest would insist they put a great big fork in, and whatever came out clinging to the fork, they said, that's mine, you can give the rest to God. They were immoral. They slept with women at the doorpost to the temple. That was Eli's sons, who were priests. In that dreadful spiritual culture, Eli had no doubt witnessed instances of drinking and drunkenness, but he mistakes Hannah 100%. Here's misunderstanding number 3. Okay? That Eli, the man, the one person, her minister, you might say, the one person who should have known better, misunderstands her. I wonder whether you've ever felt those in leadership in any fellowship you've been part of. I'm not making any, not talking about anything specific, of course. Those in leadership in a fellowship have misunderstood you. That's a great sadness, that can be. And there's a deep irony, whether or not she realizes it, in her reply. Because she says, don't, well, the NIV says, don't take your servant for a wicked woman, a better translation, don't take me for a worthless person. The irony of that is that just a bit later in the next chapter almost, what does it say about Eli's sons? They were worthless. See? Don't take me being worthless. You have worthless sons, you may not. She's not saying that, of course, but Eli thinks wrongly. Well, you know, Eli says, go in peace, may the God of Israel grant what you have asked. And you know the sequel. She goes home, in due course she conceives and gives birth, and names him Samuel. Well, what do we learn about this woman Hannah from this incident? Notice 3 things quickly. She never stopped going to the house of God year by year by year by year. Despite all that was going on, how easily she could have become resentful. You think I should go up year by year and pray to God? She doesn't. She never misses a single year. Perhaps apply that to your own hearts, to my heart. Yes. Secondly, she never stopped praying. When it says, as verse 12, she kept on praying to the Lord, and Eli observed her mouth. There's a sense that this was prolonged prayer. Maybe more and more she prayed. Sometimes our disappointments and sadnesses continue, we might pray less. It seems that the more that her sadness continued, she prayed more. She says, it was prayer from her heart. What does she say? How does she talk about her prayer? I've been pouring out my soul before the Lord. It has a sense of praying so that you almost empty yourself of prayer. I wonder whether you know that hymn, simple 19th century hymn. I often say my prayers, but do I ever pray? Does the meaning of my heart go with the words I say? I may as well bow down and worship gods of stone as offer to the living God a prayer of words alone. I wonder whether there's something you have poured out your soul before the Lord for years and years and years. But in the face of all this, she doesn't miss going to the house of God, she never stops praying. Nonetheless, she can recognize and accept consolation. After Eli changes his tune and says, "Go in peace, may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him," it says she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. That is no small thing. It's as if suddenly God confirms to her heart, you may know what's going to happen, you may not know what's going to happen, but I know. And she starts to eat something she'd never done before. And she carries on. I say a little, we didn't read the rest of the chapter. In my NIV, from verse 21 to the end, it's headed Hannah dedicates Samuel. But I just want to say a little bit about Elkanah. I've been talking, perhaps mainly thinking of women in mind, but men? What do we think about Elkanah? He also was childless by the wife he loved. And though we saw his failure to fully understand the sadness of his wife, one good thing about him, he never stands in her way. Where do we see this? Well, he continues to go to the house of the Lord each year. And at the beginning, Hannah didn't go because she had the child. And so Elkanah, just because his wife didn't go, it didn't mean that her husband stopped going. You know, I think sometimes husbands only go to church because their wives go. Well, this man, whatever we think of him, he wasn't going to stop going year by year. And also as well, when Hannah says as soon as the child is weaned, which of course would happen at a much later date in a child's life than in our culture, she says, I will bring him. In other words, I'll take him to Shiloh. What does he say? He says, do what seems best to you. Okay? He doesn't stand in her way. I won't look at it, but there's a passage earlier on it's in the book of Numbers where a husband had the right to overrule thoughtless vows. And Elkanah might have said, well, you made this vow when you were under pressure. God will understand. You don't need to keep it. Giving up your son that you prayed for? No, he's not that kind of man. Doesn't do that. He doesn't stand in his wife's way. And they go and we're told that they take with them a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, a skin of wine, brought into the house of the Lord. And they slaughtered the bull. They brought the boy to Eli. They. Okay, both of them. Elkanah and Hannah, both part of that, but Elkanah is following his wife. There are some occasions, husbands, when we have made a mistake and we know it, that we don't just tell our wives what to do. We are in that sense in submission to our wives. I'm deliberately using that word there on that particular instance. And they took this huge amount. The text has been changed here a bit in almost every translation. In fact, the original text actually says he took 3 bulls, not a 3-year-old bull. It's almost as if the translators can't quite get that he would have taken 3 bulls and a huge amount of flour. The flour actually was about 22 litres, so it was enough for 3 bulls. And a great big skin of wine. And that's a token of what they'd had. And they arrive there. What does Hannah meets Eli, and they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you, praying to the Lord." It's as if she says, "Eli, you may not believe it, the woman standing before you is that woman," as if she herself is amazed at what God has done for her. She says, "I've lent him to the Lord," a literal translation there. I give him to the Lord, I lent him to the Lord is actually, but it gave him, yes, because she says, "I've lent him to the Lord as long as he lives," and she says it twice over just in case anybody might think, "Oh, you know what you're saying? Do you know what you're saying?" No, she says it again, "Lent him to the Lord." And I wonder if you notice there's a little phrase, well, I haven't read it, so you wouldn't know, verse 24. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with the bull and the flour and the wine. Young as he was. I wonder whether you notice that. I wonder if your heart is moved. Here is this mother who's longed and prayed, year after year, God gives her a son. She lends him back to the Lord, little boy though he is. She gives him up. Well, just before we finish, I just wanted to say a little about a sequel to that, a continued love. It's goes on in chapter 2. We're not going to read it. We're told that about these sons of Eli, they were wicked men. They did not know the Lord. They were priests, so they weren't Christians. Okay, being a minister, being an elder, being a deacon, being a Sunday school teacher doesn't necessarily mean somebody's a Christian. Sadly, they were priests. They weren't Christians. They weren't believers. And so year by year after this, the family returned to Shiloh. They go there, and she keeps her vow. Now you might have thought that she would have thought that, well, do I really need to have my son here with these pretty worthless characters? She keeps her vow. And we're told this, chapter 2 and verse 19, verse 18. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. We don't know quite what an ephod is, but some sort of cloak, simple cloak. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. I love that. I like to imagine her each time that time of year approaches. She sets aside time, looks for exactly the right kind of material. She talks to Elkanah. How much do you think he would grow in the last year? What size should I make this robe? And she sews, she crochets maybe, she perhaps embroiders the little robe that would go with that linen ephod. And she takes it. Year by year. What is we then told? Then they go home. We're told the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She herself had children. 5 children, 3 sons, 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. And you know, at that very moment, Hannah disappears from the picture. There is no mention of Hannah anywhere else in the Bible. I tried looking, you know those long genealogies you find some in the book of Chronicles, it goes on for chapters and chapters and chapters, 9 I think. And then of course at the beginning of Matthew and of Luke, genealogies. There are some women mentioned there, aren't there? Ruth is mentioned, we talked about earlier. Is Hannah mentioned? Nowhere else in the Bible is a single word mentioned about Hannah. But I hope she doesn't disappear from our hearts and our minds this morning. I don't think she disappeared from Eli's awareness. He'd learnt a lot from that woman. The profound impression made by her for the petition she asked of the Lord, it says. Never left him. I doubt, remember where we started, who's impressed you in your life? I doubt anyone in the whole of Eli's long life ever impressed him like Hannah. I'm quite sure of that. I don't think it exaggerates to say she was probably the most significant spiritual influence on his adult life. Central to a realization, I think, that shortly after this, finally, after letting things slide, he rebukes his worthless sons. I think that was prompted by seeing Hannah. There she disappears. You said, I said earlier on, it's an ordinary family, quite well to do, but ordinary family. Hannah was an ordinary person. I don't know, do you think you're just an ordinary person? Well, I think probably, I don't know, you all individually, but my guess is 99% of us here are just ordinary people. I'm not going to go down in the history of the UK or any other country where we identify as our homeland. Nobody's going to read about us as far as we know. But here was one who, though having to bear much and be misunderstood by the 3 closest people to her, did so much. They are the people that God remembers. God remembered Hannah in the sense of her having a child. God remembers ordinary people who live faithfully day by day, who pray without ceasing, who are unflagging, week by week at the house of God. They are the people God remembers. They are those who, through whom ministers, husbands, and as a woman, children, may and do find much blessing. Well, may God make, especially women here today, make you like Hannah. Whatever trial, whatever difficulty you think you may have faced, may God make you like Hannah. If you're a man here this morning, speaking to myself, save us from being misunderstanding like Elkanah and Eli. Make us good husbands, good children in God's sight. Amen. Well, we're going to sing in closing a hymn